Hi guys, good evening. My name is Shan, and as for today's lesson, we will be going through demand versus supply, and I do illustrate some graph using demand and supply within the slides, and we will be going through one past year question. It's a discussion question, and we'll have a short recap before we conclude on today's lesson. I believe the session would not take more than 10 minutes, so welcome to my page, and let's now move on to the first area of the theory. Let's begin with theory, demand versus supply. The key areas that we will be focusing on includes definition, the law, factors that cause a shift, and a formula that will be used in order to calculate the price elasticity of a product. So when we look into demand and supply, we will have to understand the perspective that we are looking into. In terms of demand, we are looking from a perspective as a consumer. In terms of the supply, we are looking from a perspective as a producer. So the definition of demand states willingness of consumers to buy a good and service at a given price. And the definition for supply refers as willingness of producers to supply a good and service at a given price. Let's move on what the law states. The law of demand states an increase in price leads to a decrease in quantity demand, which is also referred as inverse relationship. Whereas in law of supply states an increase in price of a product leads to an increase in quantity supply. So this means it's a more of a direct relationship. Moving on to factors that cause a shift. So when we are talking about a shift in demand or supply, it's either to the left or to the right. So the factors that cause a shift in demand includes income, tax, price of substitute, complements, taste and fashion, and also population. So for an example, low income people will be unable or they would not be able to afford to buy a luxury item. So this is when the demand shifts to the left. Whereas factors that cause a shift in supply curve includes cost of production, changes in the quantity of resources available, and technology. So when we look into technology, the example that I could include here is that back in Shanghai, there was this automobile. In order to utilize technology, they have introduced robotics and which has replaced the laborers in order to manufacture the cars. So they were being much more efficient and the production has also increased. So which means the supply curve shifting towards the right with using technology. Moving on to the formula that will be used for this lesson would be price elasticity demand of a product. Percentage change in quantity demand divided by percentage change in supply. Students, do not get things confused. The common error that I could see is normally, it's very common to see most of y'all get this confused. So I would suggest y'all to practice a little extra when it comes to multiple choice. So that would help y'all to understand these formulas better. Okay, let's now move on to the next slide. The graph for demand versus supply. Looking at this graph here, demand curve shows a downward sloping. As I've stated in my previous slide, when the price of a product falls, the quantity demand for the product eventually increase. That is why the demand slope downwards. If you could see sloping downward, this is demand. All right, guys, let's move on. In terms of supply, the supply is upward. Why is the supply going upward? Because I did mention in my previous slide, it's a direct relationship. Quantity supply increase, the price of the good increase as well. So that is why demand sloping downwards and supply sloping upwards. Let's then move on. Moving on a little bit on how actually price is being determined in the market. If we look into this graph here, the center point, the intersection between demand and supply is known as equilibrium point. So whenever you see a point that does not come between an intersection, whichever lines that it touches, that would either be a shortage or a surplus. So as I've indicated in the equation here, quantity demand equals to quantity supply is referred as equilibrium point, and quantity demand when it's not equivalent to quantity supply is known as disequilibrium point. Let's move on to the next. So let's now move on to the past year question. So there's only one discussion question that we will be doing for today's lesson. If we look into this question, it's an 8 marks question. Discuss whether demand for cars is likely to increase in the future. In order to gain 8 marks, students, you are supposed to be looking into 2 divisions. The first division will be why it might increase in demand for cars. The second division is why it might not increase the demand for cars. So there will be a concern whether are you supposed to be drawing a graph to show a shift. Yes, I would strongly suggest you to draw a graph to show the shift. But as for now, let's just go through a little bit on the content bit without any illustration of graph. So when you look into a question like this, you have to refer back to the factors that we have covered in the earlier bits of our lesson today. So the factors that I've mentioned in my previous slides would be income level. So for an example, you need to expand each one of these points in order to get 4 marks for each division. So 4 marks on why it might increase demand and 4 marks on why it might not increase in demand. For an example, using rise in income, pretty much people can afford to buy cars, so there will be an increase in demand for cars. That is what I meant by rise in income. Moving on, we have got price of cars may fall, so people could also afford to buy because they do have additional cash where they are able to spend on. Rise in population, another reason it could be a reason why there's an increase in demand for cars. And on other end, why it might not increase in demand, substitute. So there are other forms of transportation that could be used. For an example, public transportation, or maybe people would rather ride a bike instead. So that could be another reason why there is no demand for cars. So each one of these factors here gives you about 2 marks. So you need knowledge and you need an application in order to get a full score for this question here. I'm not going to brief you so much on illustration of graph. I'll be doing this in my next lesson. So as for now, let's have a clear conclusion bit. I'm just going to have a quick recap session where what we have highlighted. So the key areas that I've highlighted throughout the lesson is we have gone through a little bit on the theory of demand and supply. I've also gone through on the intersection of the graph where it shows the equilibrium point and it shows a little bit on the disequilibrium point, and also we have gone through on just briefly on the past year question. Stay tuned for my second lesson, which I will be uploading in a couple of weeks. Feel free to provide your comments below, guys. Thank you very much for your time and have a nice day.